Hi, welcome to Vera Voices, a podcast series from the Vera Institute of Justice. I'm Michael Jacobson, Vera's director, and we're here today with Sudhir Venkatesh, a professor of sociology at Columbia University and a well-known ethnographer and urban researcher. Well, welcome, Sudhir, and thanks for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
You've had, for the last 18 months or so, a pretty interesting experience for a sociologist being assigned to work at the Department of Justice for a while. Why don't you just tell us a little about that?
I gotta say, I was pretty surprised to get a call from the FBI director and some of his senior staff. They called because they'd heard a little bit about the work that I've done for much of my life on street gangs. And the way they explained it was that I was not, and I never have been, a gang member, but I went into a community and learned a little bit about a group that was very different from the group that I had spent time with as a kid, where I'd grown up. And they said, you know, our officers, our staff, we do a lot of that. We're trying to go into places, we don't know a lot about it. Help us kind of figure out how to do it better. How do we see things? How do we help solve crimes? How do we help the communities that we're in? And so a journey began for 18 months where the director and his staff would send me out to field offices to talk to people from a whole range of issues, from how do junior and senior law enforcement officers work with one another, how does the FBI work with other institutions in the community, how do they keep data, what kind of data is useful for trying to either predict crime or to solve crime. So as a kind of, as a researcher and a geek, it was great to be around a very complicated and incredible organization, just to understand how they use information to solve crimes.
And did you have essentially sort of unfettered access to places and people?
I think there's a little bit of a sea change in some law enforcement agencies in the sense that they are either been forced to be more open or they've taken it upon themselves to be more open to figure out how are we using resources effectively, the world is changing, are we keeping up with it, and particularly with respect to criminal issues like gang activity or credit card fraud, etc. These often aren't based in a single jurisdiction. These often could be transnational or multinational. And so I got the sense that they're trying to find help wherever they can get it.
And did that openness, which there clearly was at the top sort of executive management levels, did you get that same kind of openness or feeling from what are, you know, essentially the street level bureaucrats, the agents themselves?
I have to say I saw a really interesting set of tensions at the local level, and one of them just had to do with what counts as intelligence. So in any law enforcement organization probably you have this issue, but at the federal level I think it's particularly acute because they might come into an area and you have one group of people who really believe that good policing is in the gut. You know what, I've been a cop for 20 years, you can show me all the stats and graphs in the world, but this is about me going out there and building up informants and getting to know the community. And then you have another group that says, yeah, intelligence is really working with good quantitative information, scientific information. You know, sometimes those two voices don't often get along. I think the bridge that helped people to listen to one another, and it was remarkable how well they actually did listen to one another, was that they were putting themselves on the line, you know, their lives on the line, and so they didn't want to be wrong. And that was a message I think the director was constantly using to tell them whatever egos and whatever kinds of prejudices you might have about what's right and wrong policing, at the end of the day, try and see if you can put those aside only in the interest of keeping everyone safe and going forward.
Let me ask you one final question about this, because Vera, over the last few years, works with a lot of enforcement agencies, police agencies, specifically around the issue of new immigrants, language access, and police relationship with new immigrant communities. And one would think that this would be an issue for line-level officers, especially given the mistrust that immigrants have, especially obviously undocumented immigrants, about talking to or dealing with any kind of, certainly federal enforcement agencies. Did you get a sense that, you know, back to the sort of intelligence gathering, dealing with people in the community that was a big issue for their work?
There still needs to be a great deal of learning in the law enforcement community about how these immigrant areas operate, immigrant populations, what their fears are, what their anxieties are, what helps them to be better citizens, and what their anxieties are about just participating in a socially productive way. So much is fear-based. And so much is just driven by insecurity that unless we understand that, we're always going to jump the gun and say they're delinquents, they've got a cultural pathology, they shouldn't be in this country, etc. I think there's a little bit of tolerance that needs to drive some of this conversation.
Really interesting. Well, I want to pivot a little because I want a chance to talk about some of your current research, which is seems like a world away from your last 18 months in communities and about regulation system and decision making in communities. So tell us a little about what you're doing now.
So when I arrived in Chicago, it was a very long time ago in the mid-1990s, early 1990s, I started paying attention to the ways in which people solve problems on the ground when the police don't become involved, mostly in minority communities, mostly in poor communities. And there's this concept that anthropologists sometimes will use called a system of indigenous justice, where people have all sorts of morals and codes of conduct, and there's even brokers or a kind of an alternate police force that will go and punish people, etc. And for a long time, we tended to look at that as vigilante justice. But now you see with organizations like Ceasefire in Chicago or the SNUG folks in New York that they're trying to figure out, when you look at these kinds of justice mechanisms in a community, can we use those productively to help law enforcement? And that's where I'm trying to go in my research.
I personally tend to think of this more in terms of some of the international work we do. We work in Africa a lot, and we build sort of empirical indicators around rule of law. And there, we think a lot about informal systems of justice, because in a lot of ways, in a lot of places we work, those are the primary or predominant systems of justice.
I think when we look at informal justice, we'll probably go to South Africa or Nigeria or maybe Latin America. But you can go into Williamsburg and look at the Shomrim, I believe is the name, and just look at the Orthodox Jewish community and how they rely on members of their own community to attend to problems. And you can go into ethnic enclaves in Chinatown and in Little Italy. They have the same kinds of histories. I just think it doesn't get as much attention here because we have such a good police apparatus and law enforcement apparatus, but that doesn't mean that we can't do better to use those folks to strengthen communities and work with them, especially immigrant communities, to bring them into the system a little bit.